Welcome to WikiPodcast. Today, we're diving deep into something pretty fundamental to how we all get through life, especially the tough bits. We're talking about defense mechanisms. You know, those ways our minds, often behind the scenes, try to protect us.
Exactly. Think of them as these unconscious psychological processes. They're really the mind's way of creating a buffer, shielding us from thoughts, feelings, anxieties that come up, whether from internal conflicts or, external pressures.
Right, so like a mental bodyguard we didn't even know we hired.
Sort of, yeah. And our goal today is to really unpack that. What are these mechanisms? How do they actually function as our built-in coping systems?
Okay, so unconscious is key here. We're not usually aware we're doing this.
Most of the time, no. It's often automatic. The primary purpose is to protect the self, the ego, from anxiety, or maybe to give us a bit of breathing room from situations we just can't handle right at that moment.
Okay. So this isn't just something we see in, like, clinical settings. It's more everyday than that.
Oh, absolutely. It's universal. Healthy individuals, you, me, everyone, we use a whole range of different defense mechanisms throughout our lives. It's a totally normal part of how our psyche works.
This is like a standard feature, not a bug.
Precisely. It's part of our mental toolkit for managing life.
But there's a flip side, isn't there? You mentioned they can become problematic. How does that work? When does protection turn into, well, a problem?
That's the crucial point. While they're protective, if we rely too heavily or rigidly on certain defenses, especially the, let's say, less mature ones, it can actually get in the way. It can lead to maladaptive behavior, affecting our mental health, our physical health, our relationships, because we're avoiding dealing with the root issue.
Okay, so a shield can become a cage if we use it too much. Where did this whole idea even come from? Who first started talking about defense mechanisms?
Well, the concept has roots in Sigmund Freud's work, but it was really his daughter, Anna Freud, who brought it into focus. Her book from 1936, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, was really groundbreaking. She detailed 10 specific mechanisms that Sigmund Freud had already identified.
10? Wow, what were they? Do we know the list?
We do. Let's see. There was repression, regression, reaction formation, isolation, undoing, projection, introjection, turning against one's own person, reversal into the opposite, and sublimation or displacement.
Okay, that's quite a list. Some of those sound familiar, others less so. What was Sigmund Freud's take on how they functioned?
He viewed them primarily as the ego's way of dealing with the demands of the id, those basic instinctual drives. So defense mechanisms would either distort those id impulses, making them less threatening, or block them entirely, either consciously or, more often, unconsciously.
And Anna Freud built on that. How was her perspective maybe a bit different?
She saw them perhaps more as learned patterns, like intellectual or motor automatisms that develop over time, both voluntarily and involuntarily. She also introduced this really interesting idea of signal anxiety.
Signal anxiety, what's that?
The idea is that anxiety itself acts as a kind of warning signal from the ego. It anticipates some kind of internal instinctual tension building up, and that feeling of anxiety is the cue, the signal, that prompts the ego to deploy a defense mechanism to prevent feeling overwhelmed.
Ah, okay, so anxiety isn't just the thing being defended against, it's also the trigger for the defense, like a smoke alarm for the mind.
Exactly, it's a proactive signal.
You mentioned Anna Freud focused on 5 main mechanisms in her research. Can we dig into those a bit? They seem pretty central.
Absolutely, these are probably the most well-known. First, there's repression.
Okay.
This is the big one. It's the unconscious exclusion of distressing or unacceptable desires, thoughts, or memories from our conscious awareness, like shoving something into a mental closet.
And it might still rattle the door sometimes.
Precisely. It doesn't just disappear. It can surface in disguised ways, perhaps in dreams or slips of the tongue.
Okay. What about regression?
Regression is essentially falling back to an earlier developmental stage. When faced with stress, an adult might revert to behaviors that felt safer or more comforting in childhood, like becoming overly dependent or having a tantrum.
Yeah, I think we can all picture moments like that, maybe under extreme pressure. And projection.
Projection is when we unconsciously attribute our own unacceptable feelings or impulses onto someone else. So if I'm feeling angry but can't accept it, I might accuse someone else of being angry with me. It shifts the focus outwards.
Right, easier to see the fault in others than in ourselves sometimes. What about reaction formation? It sounds kind of counterintuitive.
It is. Reaction formation involves behaving in a way that's the exact opposite of how you unconsciously feel, often to an exaggerated degree. Someone with, say, unconscious feelings of resentment might act overly friendly and solicitous. The excessive behavior masks the underlying unacceptable urge.
like bending over backwards to prove you don't feel that way.
Exactly. And the last of the 5 she focused on is sublimation.
Okay.
Sublimation is generally seen as a more mature, adaptive defense. It's channeling those unacceptable impulses or anxious energy into socially acceptable, often constructive activities. Think of someone channeling aggressive energy into sports or intense emotions into artistic creation.
So transforming the energy into something positive. That makes sense. Were there other major thinkers who added to this picture?
Oh, yes, definitely. Otto Kernberg, for example, talked about primitive defenses, things like splitting, projection, denial, especially in relation to borderline personality organization. He saw these as stemming from earlier developmental issues.
And Robert Plutchik, he linked defenses to basic emotions.
Yes, that's a fascinating angle. He proposed specific pairings like reaction formation linked to joy or denial to acceptance, repression to fear, and so on. He tried to map defenses onto our core emotional experiences.
It really shows how complex this is, with different ways to categorize and understand them.
It really is. Even the DSM, the Psychiatric Diagnostic Manual, in its 4th edition, had a tentative axis just for defense mechanisms, drawing heavily on George Valent's work.
And people are still proposing new ones, like time distortion.
Exactly. It's an evolving field. Research continues, trying to refine these concepts. Different theorists definitely have different ways of slicing the pie.
Let's talk more about Valent's model. You mentioned it was hierarchical, a 4-level system.
Yes, George Valent's work, based on the long-term Grant study of Harvard men, is really influential. He proposed a hierarchy of defenses based on their adaptiveness. Crucially, his focus was on how these related to overall mental health and the capacity to adapt to life, not just pathology.
Okay, so levels of maturity, in a way. What's at the bottom, level I?
Level I, you call the pathological or psychotic defenses. These involve significant breaks with reality. Think psychotic denial, completely refusing to acknowledge external reality, or delusional projection distortion. These seriously rearrange reality to avoid having to cope with it. You see them most clearly in psychosis, but maybe milder forms in dreams or early childhood.
Okay, so really fundamental distortions. What's level 2?
Level 2 holds the immature defenses. These are more common in adults than level 1, but still problematic if overused. Examples include fantasy as an escape, projection, non-delusional, passive aggression, acting out impulses, hypochondriasis, splitting. They lessen immediate distress, but often lead to social difficulties and don't really solve the underlying problem, often seen in depression and personality disorders.
Right, so they provide some relief, but at a cost. Moving up to level 3.
Level 3 are the neurotic defenses, very common in adults. This includes things like intellectualization, focusing only on the rational aspects, ignoring emotions, reaction formation, dissociation, displacement like kicking the cat instead of your boss, and repression. These can work well in the short term, but reliance on them can cause long-term issues in relationships, work, just general satisfaction.
Okay, the everyday struggles territory for many, perhaps. And finally, level 4, the top tier.
Level 4 are the mature defenses. These are associated with emotionally healthy adults. This is where we find humor, being able to see the irony or absurdity in difficult situations. Sublimation, suppression, consciously deciding not to dwell on something right now, altruism, and anticipation planning realistically for future stressors. These are generally conscious, adaptive, and help integrate feelings rather than just blocking them. Considered virtuous even.
Humor as a mature defense, that's great. It shows it's not about not feeling things, but how you handle them.
Exactly. It allows expression and connection without being overwhelmed.
Now, there's also Perry's Defense Mechanism Rating Scale, the DMRS. How does that fit in? Sounds more detailed.
It is more detailed. The DMRS identifies 30 specific defenses and organizes them into 7 levels, ranging from the most adaptive down to the least. The idea is to give a more fine-grained defense diagnosis.
7 levels. Can you give us a taste of the top and bottom?
Sure. At the top, level 7, the high adaptive level, you've got things we've mentioned like sublimation, affiliation, turning to others for support, self-assertion, suppression, altruism, humor. These build resilience. Down at level 1, the action level, are things like passive aggression, help rejecting, complaining. Someone asks for help but shoots down every suggestion and acting out. These tend to discharge tension impulsively but block real resolution.
Okay, a really granular way to look at someone's defensive style. So how does all this defense mechanisms relate to just plain coping? Are they the same thing?
Good question. They're related but distinct. The key difference usually boils down to consciousness. Coping strategies are generally seen as conscious, intentional efforts using logic and reason to manage stress or negative emotions. Think problem solving, seeking support, reframing thoughts. Defense mechanisms, as we've said, are typically unconscious, more automatic, often driven by impulse or the need to immediately reduce anxiety, sometimes distorting reality to do so.
But they both aim to help us adapt, right, to balance things out.
Exactly. You could see both as mechanisms of adaptation. They both function to regulate difficult emotions like anxiety or guilt. And the types of mechanisms we use, whether more adaptive defenses and coping strategies or more non-adaptive defenses, play a big role in the vulnerability stress model of mental health. Adaptive ones are protective factors. Non-adaptive ones increase vulnerability.
So becoming more aware of our defenses might actually help us shift towards more conscious adaptive coping.
That's a really important implication, yes. Understanding your patterns is the first step towards potentially modifying them and developing healthier ways to navigate stress and emotions, which is key for personal growth, especially when dealing with past difficulties or trauma.
This has been incredibly illuminating. It really puts a lens on those hidden currents within us.
It does, and just noticing them without judgment initially can be powerful.
Right. A final thought for everyone listening. Maybe take a moment to consider which of these mechanisms might resonate with you. Which ones pop up in your own life when stress hits?
Understanding them isn't about labeling, but about gaining insight into your reactions, your feelings, and maybe finding more flexibility in how you respond.
Absolutely. How understanding them can really offer insights into dealing with stress, difficult emotions, and ultimately fostering that personal growth we all strive for. Thanks for listening. Rate us in the comments your opinion on the episode and what other topics you would like us to talk about. Subscribe to the channel to help more listeners reach our episodes. Thank you and have an amazing day.